accessible. It's also kind of interesting and diverse. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Louis Kahn to addressing.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Well, as they say on Monty Python, and now for something completely different. Before getting into this, I'd just like to reflect on what a tremendous symposium this has been, how much I've learned from the talks that we've heard already, and really how much in awe I am of the speakers that we've heard up till now, just in the sense of how hands-on the work is that they do, how admirable Louis Wright's research and Tom Dutton's interventions in the social problems of Cincinnati are, Ivor Wall's explanation of the structural dynamics of that disaster, and besides which, that was one of the most brilliant performances of interpretive dance that I've seen in a long time. And it really humbles me in a way because it really makes me realize what a luxury it is for me as a humanities professor, as a literature person, to really kind of be able to step back from that concrete, hands-on, reality-based intervention and kind of reflect on the inner dynamics of thought processes and how language operates and how we assemble our world out of the various input that reality gives us, or that our minds produce as a result of our reflective thoughts on our experience. So, okay, well, let me get into this then. The talk will go through these 5 sections that you see listed here, and I'll kind of pause and give you the title of each of them just to sort of provide articulations as I go through this material. But also Tom Dutton's talk yesterday reminded us of a phenomenon of Russian constructivism, as that was part of the overall social revolution in the 20s in Russia. And so constructivism as a concept also has this artistic, aesthetic meaning, and in a way, if you the images of constructivism, what I immediately thought of was Tatlin has this sculpture called, I think, Memorial to the Second or Third International, but it really looks just like a pile of beams all stacked up on top of each other. And in a way, what you see is that kind of destruction and creation are both implied by the what seems to be a random pile of stuff that could have been standing and just sort of fell down. But in fact, it's assembled to, I think, be a symbol for that intermediate state somewhere between destruction and creation. But the term constructivism in this talk, my understanding is really comes out of mathematical discourse. Constructivism as the sense that we can create forms within our minds. We can, in inner vision, assemble structures that are purely internally driven, perhaps by the dynamics of mathematical concepts. And so this mode of constructivism then comes more from a sort of mathematical, philosophical orientation. All right, let's give it a look. Varieties of constructivism. At the beginning of his 1974 essay on constructing a reality, Austrian-born cyberneticist Heinz von Förster, who was then director of the Biological Computer Laboratory at the University of Illinois recounted how perhaps 10 or 15 years ago, some of my American friends came running to me with the delight and amazement of having just made a great discovery. I am living in an environment. I have always lived in an environment. I have lived in an environment throughout my whole life. Yet despite the ecological revelation of their newfound environment, according to von Förster, his friends had yet to make another and even more crucial discovery. Quote, when we perceive our environment, it is we who invent it. Unquote. And more recently, media philosopher Pierre Levy, in his 1998 meditation, Becoming Virtual Reality in the Digital Age, restated and extended this thesis. Every life form invents its world, and with this world, a specific space and time. Now, von Förster's theoretical position is an unusually explicit version of constructivism, which is a line of thought applying in various ways the idea that we invent the world that we perceive. It's important to note that von Förster's constructivism stems from the discourse of systems theory, and in this paper I'll try to explain what that importance is. But some may find the truth of his thesis easier to accept when it's presented in forms that can be dismissed as fantasy, as in any number of Escher engravings that play with perceptual paradoxes. So I'll let this sink in for a moment. Here's a building you might try to assemble, but I don't know if you can quite be able to make it happen. The illusion this engraving extracts from our cognitive faculties, however, is an allegory of the illusion to which we attain whenever we succeed in attributing sense experience solely to the exterior objects that occasion. But paradoxically, both levels of this illusion, the artistic or design level and the phenomenological level of perception per se, place the observer in workable relations to their environment. Systems theory would explain that while not precisely a Moebius strip, Escher's impossibly perpetual waterfall does exhibit the strange loopedness that sets cybernetic system environment couples apart from more traditional linear and causal models of systems. That is to say that essentially you've got a loop going around and around, and this circularity or loopedness is one of the primary elements of the kind of systems theory that I'll be talking about. Circularity, recursivity, feedback loops, the re-entry of output as input, these are real processes of systematic operation that enable us to construct and perceive the real limitations of classical intuitions of systems dynamics. And here, one of these more traditional intuitions of those dynamics would be strictly linear models. That is, you just have an input, it goes into a box, it pumps out an output, and the output then just continues on in a strictly linear fashion. The transition from simple input-output distinctions to complex recursive functions points us toward a crucial aspect of the constructivism associated with systems theory, namely the paradoxicality of the boundary through which system-environment couples are organized. For this boundary is closed and open at the same time. The boundary both encloses the operations of the system and opens it for its internal construction of the external environment. So without operational closure, the system could not observe its environment at all. And by the same token, all observations translate that which is observed into the terms of the observing system. This, I take it, is the basic sense of von Foerster's claim that when we perceive our environment, it is we who invent it. And with regard to the operational closure of observing systems, as sociological systems theorist Niklas Luhmann puts it, the constructivist paradox is that, quote, only non-knowing systems can know, or one can only see because one cannot see. Now, in the same 1974 paper, von Foerster proceeds to a do-at-home experiment designed to show that blind spots are built into our observations of environments as well as of systems. Okay, so this is Xeroxed out of the article that von Foerster wrote. You can't quite perform this experiment at the moment, but you can kind of construct it on a piece of paper later and see that it will actually work as he explains. Hold the book with the right hand, close left eye, fixate star, figure 1 with right eye, move book slowly back and forth along line of vision until at an appropriate distance, round black spot disappears. With star, well-focused spot should remain invisible, even if book is slowly moved parallel to itself in any direction. Why does this happen? This localized blindness is a direct consequence of the absence of photoreceptors, rods or cones, at that point of the retina, the disc, where all fibers leading from the eye's light-sensitive surface converge to form the optic nerve. But unless we are guided in such fashion to discover this blotch in our visual reception, we remain blind to our blindness, because otherwise our cognitive systems operate so as to cover over their deficits. Quote, this blindness is not perceived at all. Neither is something present nor is something absent. Whatever is perceived blotchless, unquote. So the neurophysiology of the eye for von Foerster offers a paradigm of the blind spot and the occulting of that blind spot that inhabit both the structure and the operation of every observing system. So in such fashion, what I'm calling strong constructivism rearticulates the logic of knowledge and the conditions of its possibility through the structure of the system-environment couple. Strong constructivism is a crucial refinement in the philosophical mode of epistemological constructivism, for which conceptual contingencies are both inner and outer, both phenomenological and sociological. In Luhmann's terms, they concern the interpenetration of psychic and social systems. The conception of the environment that informs von Foerster's postulate that the environment as we perceive it is our invention is inextricable from the interrelated notions of system and boundary. In this form of systems theory, environments are always strangely looped into corresponding systems. They emerge as such only when a system demarcates itself from that environment by means of a boundary that it must then maintain in order to remain visible as a system, or in the jargon of the discipline, in order to continue the autopoiesis, or self-referential self-construction of the system. So these stipulations, I contend, remove strong constructivism from the realm of idealism or any notion that we're sort of solipsistically enclosed in our minds and can't really know anything about reality. Rather, in this form of constructivism, environments are really there, compounded of raw reality, matter, energy, information, living beings, social groups, sufficiently loosely coupled that systems can inscribe these elements with their own forms. Strong constructivism accounts for both the creation and the observational recreation of that which has taken systematic or autopoietic shape in the world, what is constructed in every instance generates a complex embedding of system-environment couples. As I was drafting this paper, my working title was Nestedness, right? Just the sense that these forms nest in each other like Chinese boxes, and then must be understood as setting up the need to find ways to sort of move from level to level within these constructions. When we draw boundaries in order to indicate objects and events, our drawing of outer boundaries is itself drawn at the inner boundary that ensures the operational closure of our system of cognition. So, everything known refers in the first place to the forms by which it is known, and those forms always contain more than meets the eye, as in the miraculous geometry of Escher's waterfall, and less than meets the eye, a blind spot, a place where we cannot see that we cannot see what's there. Okay, varieties of modernity. So, why is it that we've only recently noticed that systems are inexorably coupled to the environments they construct in order to arise as systems? It's as if the environment has long occupied a cognitive blind spot from which it has just recently been shifted into view. Perhaps that recognition marks a breakdown or a surpassing of our modernity, as Bruno Latour suggests in his 1993 volume, We Have Never Been Modern. Trained in the sociology of science and technology, Latour is perhaps the most flamboyant theorist and gifted writer in the field of science studies, which is very much of interest in my realm of literature and science connection. A quick summary of Latour's historical thesis in this book, We Have Never Been Modern, might go like this. Modernity arose from the suppression of the incoherence of pre-modern ideas, the way that pre-modern ideas mixed up natural and cultural causalities. But this modern sorting operation occurred at the price of enforced separations of nature and culture, or between nature and society, separations that have in turn now lost their coherence as well. According to Latour, by pursuing an anthropology of technoscientific practices, which I'll go into further a bit later in the talk, science studies has now unraveled the modern unraveling of pre-modernity. To reform academic protocols and resolve the distinctly modern conflict between industrial societies and the ecological constraints of the natural world, Latour concludes We Have Never Been Modern with a prescription for what he calls a politics of non-modern collectives, which he presents as a way beyond the impasses of modern ontological separatisms, and calls the state of non-modernity, complete with a non-modern constitution for a, quote, parliament of things. Now, Niklas Luhmann's theory of modern social systems, in contrast, is uninflected by Latour's brand of dialectical or perhaps Parisian drama. What Latour perceives as modernity, an enforced purification covering over an orgy of hybrid copulations, Luhmann views as a change in habits of differentiation, a move from a less to a more complex form of social differentiation. So Luhmann would insist we are modern, we remain modern, due to an irreversible social evolution he describes in the following manner. Social differences in pre-modern societies were stratified, predetermined by a hierarchical system of proper social positions. Modernity, our modernity, arose over time as stratified social differentiation gave way to the differentiation of social functions. And one instance of this would simply be the separation of church and state. Differentiations of social function rather than of social strata now fissure society as a hierarchical totality into relatively autonomous subsystems of government, law, science, religion, education, industry, media, and so forth and on and on. Society then, for Louis, is now a hyper-complex system of systems within systems, occupying a built environment that is itself a network of material mechanical systems embedded within a natural environment, often unperceived until on occasion it twitches catastrophically. Louis, who died several years ago, would never predict where society is headed, nor, like Latour, prescribe a direction toward which to steer it. He did, however, specify some constraints in systematic operations. According to Louis, autopoietic systems, such as societies, must constantly submit their elements to dissolution in order to go on reproducing themselves, and the constant reshuffling necessary to systematic self-reproduction ensures the emergence of difference over time, system evolution. This description goes beyond, but I think certainly includes and valorizes social democracy in its liberal and libertarian senses as a dynamic interplay of social forces and a monitored interrelation of quasi-emancipated institutions. Based on such formal considerations of the abstract conditions of systemic possibility, Louis emphasized the paradoxicality and unpredictability that inflect the temporal evolutions of social systems. All right, hybrids and paradoxes. Bruno Latour's brand of constructivist science studies exploits a strategy, a research or investigative strategy for sociological analysis developed in what's called the sociology of scientific knowledge, or SSK. A shift in focus from scientific theory to scientific practice, from the rarefied discursive end products of scientific inquiry to the nuts and bolts of laboratory instruments and procedures and the professional practices of assembling, interpreting, and disseminating experimental results. At the level of experimental practice and its publication, scientists and technicians must negotiate with non-human actors as well as human colleagues, must construct networks that can connect the behaviors of persons, machines, organisms, material substances, forms of energy, and the protocols of informatic inscription and the processing of information and data. Latour's theory of modernity emerges from this crucible, the observation of scientific practice. According to Latour, quote, science studies have forced everyone to rethink anew the role of objects in the construction of collectives, that is to say, the networked interrelation of human and non-human elements and actors. Thus, continues Latour, challenging philosophy, unquote. That is, in particular, challenging previous assumptions governing the construction of scientific knowledge. But since these assumptions have enjoyed cultural preeminence in the West since Bacon, Descartes, and Newton, Latour considers this challenge to extend to modernity altogether. So, for Latour, intellectual modernity has been determined by a meta-narrative that recites the epistemological charter science signed, as it were, with Western society in the 17th century. In We Have Never Been Modern, Latour writes, "The word modern designates two sets of entirely different practices which must remain distinct if they are to remain effective, but have recently begun to be confused. The first set of practices by translation," and that would be actually the bottom part of this diagram, "creates mixtures between entirely new types of beings, hybrids of nature and culture. The second practice, or set of practices, by purification, creates entirely distinct ontological zones, that of human beings on the one hand, that of non-humans on the other. So long as we consider these two practices of translation and purification separately, we are truly modern." Latour defines modernity then as the outcome of multiple distinctions. First, modernity separates absolutely the human subject from natural objects. This modern subject has been constructed on the exclusion of the non-human object, that is, on the premise of the absolute alterity or pure difference between the object of science and the human mind. In addition, modernity divides the practice of intellectual purification away from the proliferation of hybrids instigated by its practical technologies. It's as if the culture of scientific purifications proceeds in sheer separation from technology's necessary effect of mixing up ontological categories. The sum of these reductive separations Latour calls the critical project, the modern effort to sort apart the different components of every conceivable imbroglio, the word Latour likes to use to name the actual mixed up or networked hybrid assemblage of the human and the non. Latour narrates this description of modernity through what he calls the modern constitution. And under the modern constitution, the subject of science, the scientist, removed its objects to a separate ontological realm, and so confirmed the absoluteness of its objectivity, right? The scientific objectivity that it thought it could practice as a non-contingent subject possessing stable knowledge of pure objects. Paradoxically, however, Latour writes, the increasing polarization of the object and the subject only multiplied the quasi-objects. Latour terms the hybrids, half-object and half-subject, that we call machines and facts, unquote. Indeterminate entities, quasi-objects, such as scientific instruments, technological mechanisms, engineered commodities, or designed environments, anthropogenic ecological crises like the ozone hole. Okay, a really wonderful example up there somewhere of a quasi-object, something combining human creation and nature's construction. All these quasi-objects have populated our world to the point that the modern project of keeping these two levels distinct can no longer maintain the ostensible work of purification separate from the virtual proliferation of ontological hybridity. Latour sees this crisis as cresting in our current disorientation in the face of technoscientific fusions, from genetically engineered organisms to virtual realities supplying material entities with digital doubles. Now, In the face of this, Latour proposes not so much to dismantle the humanist modern subject as to relativize it by inscribing the objective modern subject within collective networks, thus distributing its subjectivity and agency into processes of relation that operate within human, non-human collectives of material, organic, and mechanical elements. Now, Luhmann, on the other hand, has a different way of moving toward a similar refiguring or reconstruction of the subject. He writes in his work, Social Systems, that in contemporary systems theory, quote, the concept of self-reference, reflection, reflexivity, is detached from its classical location in human consciousness or in the subject and transferred to the domain of objects, namely to real systems as the object of science, unquote. Luhmann subsumes the subject under the description self-referential system. Persons, like you and me, are self-referential systems, but then so are cells, bodies, and societies. But self-reference is also a formula for paradox. When Epimenides the Cretan, you'll recall, asserts self-referentially, all Cretans are liars, we cannot determine the truth or falsity of his claim. Luhmann writes, quote, self-reference possesses indeterminable complexity in the form of paradox, unquote. An immediate example of self-referential paradox is the one that we've been discussing. That is, self-referential closure of observing systems open the system, insofar as that closure alone enables the observation of the environment. That is, the translation of the environment into the internal elements that the system can then process in order to achieve an observation. Paradox, then, is the frame within which every system must function, because the potential for paradox emerges whenever a distinction is observed, as I'll get into in just a second. But I think Latour's quasi-object could be seen as just such a product of the paradoxical operations within modern social and intellectual systems. So by Luhmann's definition, in order to exist and to function, autopoietic systems must produce those forms of distinction that enable operations guided by observations, and so must increase their complexity and generate paradox as a matter of course. Okay, this section is called Observing Forms. Well, to cut this complexity down to size, we could certainly use an Occam's razor. Luhmann took such a modern retooling of such a razor to his theory of social systems by redescribing that theory in a vocabulary derived from British mathematician George Spencer Brown's book, Laws of Form. Spencer Brown propounded a calculus of distinctions. That systems theory has correlated with the markings made by acts of observation. So, systems observe by marking distinctions and crossing over those marks between marked and unmarked states. For Spencer Brown, the act of distinction, the marking of an observation, okay, which he then diagrams with this mark, to draw or construct a distinction is to mark off an inside and an outside. And this act produces the following elements, which he collectively refers to as the form. Those elements are the indication. Okay, so by making or marking a distinction you produce, you indicate something. The indication, and that is then called the marked state, or the inside of the distinction. But you also produce that which the indication excludes, or the unmarked state, the outside of the distinction. But you've also, by this act, produced the distinction itself, which both separates and unifies its inside and its outside, holding the marked and unmarked states in supplementary relation, while in addition generating a second distinction in the very act of marking an otherwise unmarked space. So in order to mark a distinction, you create not just one distinction, but a second distinction, because you can now distinguish marked space from unmarked space. Thus, a single act of distinction always already produces another distinction, from which an entire series of distinctions can ramify, and conversely, a complex of systematic distinctions can often be collapsed back to a single observation. At any given moment in the operation of an observing system, however, distinctions can function only on the inside of the forms they produce. And this is the burden of operational closure, which renders the operation of a system dependent solely on its own internal states and transformations. In Spencer Brown's form notation, this is indicated by the location of the indication on the inside, within the concave part of the distinction mark. Now, the reiteration of the indication refreshes but does not alter the form of the observation. This is how Spencer Brown diagrams it. That is, the reiteration of what you've indicated by making this distinction still leaves you with the indication. He calls this the law of condensation. That which a system can know of its environment is necessarily translated into forms maintained within the medium of its own elements. The operation of cognition in the system's theoretical sense, then, is both self-referential and recursive. At any moment of its operation, an observing system can see only the inside of the distinctions it makes. It cannot simultaneously see the unmarked state of those same distinctions, or it cannot form what Louis denotes as, quote, the unity of the distinction, unquote, or it can do so only in the form of paradox or logical contradiction. So distinctions are paradoxical because they imply a coexistence between their inside and outside terms that cannot be made operational by the observing system using them at the moment of their use. In order to do so, that is, in order to access the remainder of the information carried by the total form of any distinction, the system must cross over the initial distinction in order to mark its outer side, which crossing unmarks the previous indication. And this is how he diagrams that situation. Spencer Brown calls this the law of cancellation. So if you mark one distinction but then move out once again from it, you end up with what seems to be the elimination of your prior act of distinction. But this clearing of the indicational space is not merely an emptying. Rather, it is a mode of strong constructivism, operating as the deconstruction of the initial construction, which frees the system to remark the mark if it wants to maintain its re-entry as an ongoing operation, or perhaps to accept or form a different indication the next time around the cycle of observation. Thus, observation can operate through its distinctions, but only while blinded to the paradoxicality of its own forms. Social systems communicate through complex oscillations between the condensation and the cancellation of shared indications. However, paradoxes in the form of observation can be resolved, that is, rendered productive, in time, when another observer can observe the initial play of distinctions. This can also be diagrammed as a form of cancellation, but in this case expanded to indicate that a second-order observer can take as an indication the entirety of another observer's distinction. Okay? So if this is the first-order observer, sort of at the moment of operating that observation, limited to the inside of its form, a second observer can take what is called a second-order perspective and have as its indication the unity of the distinction of the first observer. Now, a woodcut by Albrecht Dürer can clarify this distinction between first and second order observations. Thank God for Dürer. In first order observation, here the artist, this fellow here, as first order observer of the model, all that can be seen of the form under observation, or all that will be seen when he gets done making his picture, is is the model that will occupy the entire frame of the drawing the artist is making. That is, the indication or the inside of the distinction between artist and model. So the model will occupy the entire frame of the drawing the artist is making, from which all traces of the grid through which he observes will be removed. Nor will the artist himself appear or be explicitly manifest anywhere in that drawing. In other words, in first order observation, the outside of the distinction is thrown into a cognitive blind spot. However, the form of first order observation feeds back into itself when one can observe the operations of another observer's observation. In second order observation of first order observations, the whole form of the distinction that produces the first indication, that is the unity of the distinction between that which is indicated and that which is not, can now be observed, precisely as Dürer has shown in this perspectival study of the shifting and multiplying of perspectives. Here, what is seen is not just the object, but also the formal mechanisms of its observation. Dürer's second-order perspective renders observable the way that the initial object is being observed. Of course, the second-order observer is always also in a first-order position, blind to or occulting the environment of its own system of observations. That is, we imagine that as Dürer made this engraving, there's an outside of his observation that is not present anywhere in this engraving. So, the second-order observer is always also in a first-order position, but here again, although the formal conditions of observation remain paradoxical, they work as long as one can keep shifting perspectives. All right, this section's called the form of modernity. Okay, now that we've got this observing system sketched out, let's try this observing system out on Bruno Latour's observations of the modern Constitution. So, the first dichotomy, what Latour calls the first dichotomy, cuts nature and culture apart and implicitly marks the human as the inside of the form of this observation. Observation can then cross over to the non-human, but only by leaving the human behind. Latour's first dichotomy observes at first order as a subject-object dichotomy, as a subject-object distinction, what a contemporary observer could redescribe, that is, one who had now sort of some systems theoretical concepts in hand, could now observe or redescribe as a system-environment dyad, marked out by the interiority of the modern psychic system. In Latour's description, we could say that the epistemological subject of modern knowledge, that is the human located on the inside of this first dichotomy, assures its self-reference by marking nature as exteriority, but not as environment, as systems theory has now reconceptualized the idea of environment. Hence, nature's ostensible exteriority is taken to have a separate but non-paradoxical ontological status, a status logically consistent with its modern observers. It exists as an object for us, to be known by us, to explored and broken down and put back together by us. What could be more simple? Thus, under modern observation, we could say that nature's exteriority, or the environment, is systematic but not yet environmental, not yet observed in such a way that von Foerster's friends could go, oh my God, I'm living in an environment. The paradoxes inherent in the subject-object distinction, so under the modern Constitution, remain unobservable while this Constitution validates the construction of knowledge. However, Latour's second dichotomy makes a second-order observation of the modern Constitution. The first-order theatrics of modernity, or the staging of discrete objects for an audience of objective subjects, is laid bare with a 90-degree turn toward a second-order distinction. This distinction that now indicates the unity of the prior distinction between nature and culture, humans and non-humans. So, hybrids, quasi-objects, quasi-subjects, and the networks that they form can now be seen and can now be used to see. While the former cognition of pure subjects and mere objects is blocked or surpassed by an awareness of the conceptual machinery by which those perceptions were constructed. Now, so if we take this, put it into a Luhmannian frame, Latour's argument may be seen to revolve around the issues of observability and observation. This is Latour now. Modernizing finally made it possible to distinguish and separate between the laws of external nature and the conventions of society. This is in the final chapter, We Have Never Been Modern. But the double failure of socialism at stage left and naturalism at stage right. Latour's really writing this right after the fall of the Berlin Wall and trying to rethink modernity in the aftermath of the Cold War. That double failure, according to Latour, has made the work of purification less plausible and the contradiction more visible. So we're beginning to see things that just never emerged within conceptual view until this postmodern moment of ours. Networks and quasi-objects can no longer be covered over by the blind spots in the operation of modern distinctions. Rather now, Latour says, we are obliged to consider the work of purification and the work of media, by which he means the mediations by which hybrids bring together formerly separated elements. To consider the work of purification and the work of media or translation symmetrically. Now, with this term symmetry, Latour invokes an axiom of science studies methodology originally advanced by his colleague Michel Callon, which is called the principle of generalized symmetry. Another diagram from Latour's book in which Latour remarks, quote, the anthropologist has to position himself at the median point where he can follow the attribution of both non-human and human properties. Now, translated into systems theoretical terms, Latour and Calon's principle of generalized symmetry entails the construction of a second-order observation allowing the unity of the distinction between non-human objects and human social subjects to be contemplated simultaneously. But then Latour continues with an ironic inflection, but if the fruitful contradiction between the two parts, the official work of purification and the unofficial work of mediation, has become clearly visible, won't the Constitution, the modern Constitution, cease to be effective? Latour's rhetorical question about the current observability of the modern contradiction recapitulates the traditional expectation that paradox, or at any rate the awareness of paradox, the confrontation with paradox, typically paralyzes the systems in which it emerges, in that its observational operations then fall into some kind of circular regress or debilitating oscillation, which sort of stymies the operation of its observation. So Latour's question can be rephrased. Can the distinction that founds modernity's observing system be re-entered into its own indicational space without deranging the operation of the system? Latour's formulation of modernity's very efficacy as resting on the invisibility of its constitutive contradictions may be glossed by Luhmann's explanation of the unfolding of paradox in the operation of observing systems. Luhmann says in a very excellent essay I recommend to your attention, The Paradox of Observing Systems, if we observe such a re-entry, we see a paradox. The re-entering distinction is the same, and it is not the same. But the paradox does not prevent the operations of the system. On the contrary, it is the condition of their possibility, because their autopoiesis requires continuing actuality with different operations, actualizing different possibilities. An oscillating system can preserve the undecidability of whether something is inside or outside of a form. It can preserve and produce itself as a form, that is, as an entity with a boundary, with an inside and an outside, and it can prevent both sides from collapsing into the other, kind of like the World Trade Center. A self-referential system that continuously regenerates its re-entry will be, in Heinz von Förster's terms, a non-trivial machine. And in the final sections of We Have Never Been Modern, we can plainly observe a strategy of oscillation as the Latourian observer shuttles back and forth between modernity and non-modernity, ostensibly to perform a reclamation of those elements of pre-modernity, modernity, and post-modernity that remain worthy of continued representation within a non-modern constitution. So there's a lot of detail on this diagram, but what we can basically see is the shuttling between the form of non-modernity that Latour hopes to bring about and that which seems dispensable in or obsolete in the modern constitution. The very distinction between the modern and the non-modern itself is viewed with an eye to the paradoxical productivity now of shifting across this newly constituted semantic boundary. But as we observe Latour's argument, we are now in a position to ask, what then is the outside of this second-order distinction whose inside or indication is hybrids and networks, the quasi-objects constructed and stabilized by non-modern observations? Invoking Spencer Brown's law of cancellation, the environment of the non-modern system is as yet an unmarked state that Latour can only remark or within or re-enter into his observing system constructed by the non-modern constitution as the non in non-modernity. And after all, there's not much really new about hybrids and networks other than the newly acquired form of their observability. But where this new meta-distinction will lead the operations of modernity as a social system, I think remains anyone's guess. I think that Luhmann would have been receptive to this mode of theoretical communication of Latour's, but would also have insisted that Latour's non-modernity remains a description of modernity in its present states of paradoxicality and hypercomplexity. Okay, my final section is titled An Environment That Remains Unknown. By way of conclusion, I want to glance at a late essay of Luhmann's entitled The Ecology of Ignorance, which is a meditation precisely on the vertiginous quality of the unmarked state that lies beyond our present systematic horizons. This essay of Luhmann's focuses directly on the ecological uncertainty generated by our awareness of the possible catastrophes that may have already been set into motion by 20th century modes of military and industrial production. Predicated to a great degree on the defense of Cold Warring societies from each other, those institutions have actually contributed to the collapse of the meta-narratives of salvation and progress that previously drove or guided both sides of the old geopolitical divide. If we have lost conviction in the possibility of articulating a coherent self-description of hyper-complex modern social systems, however, perhaps we have also gained some useful knowledge about our epistemological limitations. No matter how you cut them, social systems are embedded in environments more complex than anything attainable within those systems. So ignorance is the flip side of knowledge. How can we know what we can't know? We are ignorant of the extent of our ignorance. When all moral and ethical prohibitions on knowledge are lifted and we know everything we can know, what is it we still can't know? Luhmann suggests we still can't know the full complexity of our environment. What will the environment do someday that we will not have anticipated? Luhmann calls this the paradox of warning. Quote, the paradox of warning. A warning, if successful, prevents us from determining whether what we were warned of would have occurred at all. Unquote. Present indications remain ignorant of the knowledge whether what we now expect of the future will come to pass. Science, no matter how powerful or predictive, will remain a drastic simplification of the real. And governmental surveillance, unfortunately, will always work better on the inside than on the outside of the surveyed system. The point is not why bother with knowledge. I think we care to know what we can know, and that will always be the case, continuing to drive us toward knowledge. But I think we need to know that we can't know everything there is to know, and we need to act as if we knew this. One of the terrors of terrorism as a message from without our accustomed channels of communication is that it forces us to ask for more intelligence from our social authorities than they can ever give us. Total knowledge of the environment beyond our own systematic borders. So perhaps both our strategic and our architectural and design politics could use a dose of systems theoretical ethics. At the end of On Constructing Reality, written toward the end of the Vietnam conflict, still in the midst of the Cold War, Heinz von Förster stated his own ethical imperative: act always so as to increase the number of choices. This is also an information theoretical way of saying, do not foreclose unnecessarily the options a system possesses for continuing its constructions of meaning, and thus its behaviors toward its own environment. And if ethics concerns the operations of systems, the proper and best mode of operations of systems, aesthetics concerns the role of observations in guiding those operations. And von Förster concludes his article with a second aesthetical imperative that feeds back into its ethical partner. In fact, you can see it basically makes a loop. If you desire to see, learn how to act. How should one act? I submit that the proper strategy for our hyper-complex modernity is to shift into systems theoretical mode, intellectually as well as technologically. I think it's time to reform classical dyads such as part-whole divisions, subject-object dichotomies into system-environment couples, and to rethink as strange loops rather than iron curtains or us-them confrontations, as paradoxical rather than simple partitions. The borders autopoietic system-environment couples must use in order to operate and to sustain their operations. So what we might ask of current design philosophy then is some assistance in the very things that you design, in the task of refashioning our guiding distinctions so that they reflect the complex embeddedness, nestedness of systems within systems and of all systems codependence with environments that must always remain in crucial ways out of sight and out of mind. What forms the construction of such environments will take are also anyone's guess. I certainly don't know. However, finally,